Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dragonfly Parade, a podcast about our queer history and the people who make it happen. Today, we begin the parade in a somewhat controversial, yet necessary spot for the understanding of what would come after this. An author named Ihara Saikaku, or just Saikaku for short. In Japanese literature, you tend to refer to authors who are very famous by just their given name. Though there is no evidence of him personally being queer, his writing is incredibly important to queer Japanese history, and it would be very difficult for me to talk about anything else that comes later without having talked about him. Now, because I'm handling queer Japanese history, there is a content warning that is necessary. This episode discusses themes of child sexual exploitation and suicide. Though there's no evidence that the subject of our episode ever harmed a child, his writing does sometimes talk about relationships that were common and open in the time period he was writing in, but we today would find unacceptable. If that is a topic that you can't handle today, please put yourself first. I will have something for you very soon. Ihara Saikaku was a poet and short story writer from the 1600s who was incredibly influential. He wrote several of the most important surviving pieces of queer fiction from the 1600s. He was never considered high literature in his lifetime, but, neither was Shakespeare, and for much the same reason. He wrote lewd stories for everyday people. And now, he's more famous than any of his contemporaries. Ihara Saikaku was born sometime in 1642. We don't have his exact birth date, but that's only to be expected. Now, the name we know him under is a pen name, and it isn't even the only one. He was born under the name Hirayama Togo to a wealthy Osaka merchant family. Wealth did not confer status to the young Saikaku, though. The caste system in feudal Japan placed nobles and warriors at the top, then farmers under that, and then merchants as the bottom member of the official system. The understanding was that since merchants do not produce things, they were essentially parasitic. In reality, the ordering of things was largely symbolic, since samurai could cut down both farmers and merchants alike without facing repercussions, but merchants will get a little less sympathy. It should also be noted that in reality, they were not the lowest rank in society. Japan had, and arguably still has, an untouchable caste called the burakumin, or people of the village, who are people whose families have worked as butchers, tanners, undertakers, and the like, alongside people who had diseases like leprosy, who were not allowed to live in the cities. And so they lived in the villages outside the cities. So people who were low class but had access to money were in a very good place to make a living in professions adjacent to the city's massive red light districts. Artistic masters of woodcut printing like Hokusai, for example, got their starts making porn. It was a massive market in the big cities. Tokugawa-era Edo, for example, had a massive gender imbalance, with 170 to 180 men to every 100 women. In 1608, a hidalgo, a non-landowning Portuguese or Spanish noble, recorded that there were 50,000 sex workers in the imperial capital. Now, I don't know how much we can take that on its face, since the Portuguese were actively trying to colonize through Christianization, and the Spanish were famously bad at reading the room when it came to Japanese customs. I would also have to know more about that guy's access to documents and his ability to read Japanese. It's also possible for him to have seen documentation, since the red light district was incredibly over-policed and possibly would have had census information, but who knows if that information even survived. We have to look in all of the temple attics, I suppose. In any case, the culture Saikaku was born into already prioritized relationships with sex workers over relationships with wives. As a man, you would have a wife for reproduction, but you went to the brothels for love. Now, that's not a particularly good system for women or for exclusively gay men. It keeps wives from really having a hope of being the most important person in her husband's heart. She would be expected to be faithful, but her husband would be expected to have affairs. It also couldn't have been emotionally very fun for the sex workers, since it just sets bad bitches against each other. The society had an idea of work-life balance, but it was more a balance of work and sexual pleasure. As today, brothels were a place where men socialized. They took in art and they did business, all while surrounded by beautiful women that reinforced their importance by showing them how desirable they were, even if the only thing that was desired was their money. Saikaku began writing a kind of poem called Haikai no Renga, comedic linked verse, at 15, and became a master of the form by 20. Linked verse is a form of Japanese poetry where someone gives a couplet and then uses a term with a homonym or secondary meaning to change the meaning of the couplet. What makes the form comic is not that it is meant to be funny, but that the structure allows for more flexibility in how it is used, and in the way that you can use poetic diction. Saikaku still felt constrained by this loose form and never stopped pushing its limits. Because he was successful, he managed to expand the genre to a huge extent. This was often done collaboratively, where poets would get together and create verses off of the previous person's poem. So there was a super easy way for schools of poetry to form. Now, I'm unsure about whether Saikaku himself liked men. We do know that he did love his wife deeply. I don't know when he got married. He had 3 children with her, but she died when he was only 33, and he threw himself into his work to handle these feelings. A few days after her death, he composed 1,000 verses in 12 hours in her memory, and published it under the name Haikai Dokugin Ichinichi, 1,000 haikai verses in one day. He was not the greatest father, though. He joined a monastery and left his kids to be raised by family members after the death of his wife. Of course, as a monk, he continued to write comic poems. He made a name for himself in solo competitions that could become 24-hour composition frenzies called yakazu. Over a series of these competitions, Saikaku's power level just skyrocketed. In one, he composed 1,600 verses in a day and lost that competition. The next composition contest, he composed 4,000 in one day. Then he participated in a contest where he was composing so quickly that the judges were unable to record them. They only made a tally indicating that he had, indeed, composed a poem. After 24 hours, the tally counted 23,500 poems. That's absolutely wild. I did the math, and he was composing at a rate of 16 couplets per minute. This has to have been stream of consciousness, like word association. The only other option is if he was possessed by some sort of god of poetry. Imagining someone composing in that sort of fugue state is kind of terrifying. But if you're used to composing to that degree, that isn't so far from prose, especially if you have zero interest in being confined by form. I'm imagining an extremely fast rap battle. After the death of his master, Nishiyama Soin, in 1682, he was recognized as the de facto head of the school, though he had no interest in actually doing anything to teach students. He turned to writing illustrated novels and picture scrolls while living as a monk in Osaka. But at this point, they are mostly about heterosexuals. He had a strange loose writing style that got dubbed Odandaidyu, literally the Dutch style. the Holland style. He wrote both novels and collections of short stories during this time, but he spent the last decade of his life only writing short stories. His most famous publications during this time are The Man Who Loved Love, which is based on the tale of Genji. It's a telling of the amorous exploits of his protagonist, Yonosuke. The Great Mirror of Beauties, Son of an Amorous Man. The Tale of Wang Qiu. 5 Women Who Loved Love. The Life of an Amorous Woman. Now, this one is fascinating. The Life of an Amorous Woman includes a story about a lesbian or possibly a trans man. In it, the lesbian or possibly heterosexual trans man says, "You are to sleep in the same bed as your mistress, I was told. Since this was a command, I could not gainsay it. Having joined my mistress in bed then, I expected that she would ask me to scratch her hip or something of the sort. But once more I was to be surprised. For now I was bidden to take the woman's part, while my mistress assumed that of a man, and thus disported herself with me during the entire night. I had indeed been reduced to a sorry pass. The floating world is wide, and I had worked many different places, but I had never before been used like this. When I am reborn in the next world, I will be a man. Then I shall be free to do what really gives me pleasure." Thus did my new mistress voice her fondest wish. So he's less sympathetic to lesbianism, but there really isn't a cultural reason why he should see them as the same thing. Women's desire and men's desire are historically very separate in Buddhist-influenced countries. We can see he was prolific in Osaka. He had great success as an author, so we can assume his family was receiving enough to eat, even if he was not particularly present with them. Now, one of his daughters was blind, and was also clearly his favorite. When she died, he didn't even want to stay in the same place anymore, so he moved to Edo, now Tokyo. In Edo, he wrote his most famous work, The Great Mirror of Male Love. This text is dated to the 4th year of the Jokyu era, so 1687, and is signed with Saikaku's seals as both Kakue and Shoju, 2 pseudonyms he used before Saikaku stuck. He wrote The Great Mirror to expand his appeal in the 3 major cities of Japan. He had Osaka covered from his poetic career, and his poetry had been illicitly copied and published in Kyoto and Edo as well, leading to him having brand recognition before he even got there. A phenomenon we can understand in the web novel fandom. Think of how the gray legality of fan translations led to all of these authors becoming bestsellers. Something similar happened here. He arrived in an Edo that was primed to receive him. But in any case, he wanted to make a splash when he started working with an Edo-based publisher. So he went for subject matter that he knew for a fact would be broadly popular. Gay erotica. A man after my own heart. Fun fact, one of the first editions of this text is in what we call the Edogawa collection, which means it was in the possession of one Edogawa Rampo, presumably left to him by his dear friend Iwata Junichi. Both of these men will receive their own episodes. They, and their combined erotica collections, are fascinating topics. Strangely, even though The Great Mirror was Saikaku's first work written in Edo, it was not the first published, for a very funny reason. His Edo-based publisher was in a rivalry with a Kyoto-based publisher, and that publisher had just achieved success with a book of short stories about filial piety. So the Edo-based publisher had Saikaku dash out a book called 10 Stories of Filial Impiety to publish on short notice, before the new year made it an inauspicious publication. Needless to say, Saikaku outsold. Now, I haven't had time to read all of his work, but for now, I focused on the great mirror of male love. So, let's dive in. From the start, what is a great mirror? If you look at kabuki and the novels from the Edo period, everything is a great mirror. For example, I've been looking for a kabuki play called The Great Mirror of Ashia Doman for years. If anyone listening knows where I can find it, please get in touch. I have to know about this man. All the great mirrors are named in reference to a set of 4 historical tales, specifically one called simply The Great Mirror. It is an idealized biography of one notable enemy of the pod, Fujiwara no Michinaga. The word Great Mirror already had an erotic tone to it by the time Saikaku got to it. But referencing this book from the golden age of Japanese romance novels is pretty useful for him, as he is pretty much single-handedly revitalizing the genre after it had fallen out of favor for a couple hundred years. It's also important to note how he constructs male homosexuality. He divides gay men into connoisseurs of boys and women haters. The difference being that a connoisseur of boys would have a wife and then have affairs with men on the side, while a woman hater would never willingly marry and would only keep male lovers. Note that the boy was a role, not an age. A boy meant bottom, basically. Today, we might call women haters gay and connoisseurs bi and pan men. Saikaku was deeply concerned with the concept of love, and Japan never really formed the kind of body-mind detachment that makes longing in Western media so frustrating. If you love someone in Japanese media, you're also horny for them as far as Saikaku is concerned, at least up to the Meiji Restoration. But it was the norm for samurai to have beautiful page boys, whether or not they were interested in them sexually. Having beautiful retainers was a status symbol. Often, one of these page boys would be chosen as a knight mate. Once in this relationship, the younger men were bound to their elder brothers by vows and the law at the time that treated these relationships like marriages. For example, the younger men were required to stay faithful to their partners on pain of legal punishment if they took another male lover or had an affair with a woman during this time, heaven forbid. Of course, the older partner was allowed, if not expected, to have a wife and other lovers, and to visit brothels. So, on that level, it was treated as an equal kind of relationship to heterosexuality. Which is really unfortunate for these poor boys, honestly. Straight women were not doing well. It should be noted that the Tokugawa period was a time where the government was genuinely restricting a lot of the means of personal expression available to townspeople. But sex was allowed as an important kind of expression within certain prescribed boundaries. This led to a weakening of Buddhist pro-celibacy morality and the rise in a kind of pragmatic hedonism. It had to be pragmatic because it was highly regulated. You could get in legal trouble for having an affair that threatened other aspects of social hierarchy. Who doesn't generally have enough power to threaten the status quo? Sex workers. So, sex work, though regulated, was extremely popular. Saikaku parodied an old Heian phrase, "Such is the heart of the people of the capital," when talking not about the palace, but about the red light district, saying that the main draw of the capital was in fact sex work and theater. And to be fair, he was probably right. There are documented stores that specialized in sex toys for men in the red light district. Saikaku certainly believed in love being found in the brothel. But he had a line, and that line was survival sex work. In The Man Who Loved Love, for example, he punishes his protagonist, Yonosuke, for sleeping with sex workers who were in the industry not by choice, but because they could not survive without it. He considered that to be manipulation. In his moral code, one could sleep with a teenager if the teenager was enthusiastic and not pressured into it by other factors. You might disagree with where we draw the line. You can't say that that isn't an understandable place to draw it given his context. Especially with how young women were being married off during that time. Anyways, for everyday people who couldn't afford the luxuries of samurai or a merchant, there was one opportunity for enjoyment and free love. And that is a pilgrimage. While you are on a pilgrimage, the normal rules of society are suspended. In religious studies, we call this kind of practice carnival, inverting and drawing attention to the arbitrary nature of hierarchies, just temporarily, to let out steam. It ultimately reinforces those hierarchies, though, by venting anger that otherwise might erupt into a revolution. Carnivals are also frightening, since without the predictability of society's usual rules, spending time amongst other people is a much more unpredictable experience. For that reason, Saikaku enjoyed writing about them. Pilgrims might be on a journey from temple to temple, but while doing that, they would be enjoying the opportunities for enjoyment surrounding those temples. Pilgrims might be on a journey from temple to temple, but while doing that, they would be enjoying the opportunities offered surrounding those temples. And it still kind of works like that. The last time I was in Kyoto, I made the decision to walk from shrine to shrine to avoid public transit while I was filling up my Goshuincho, which is a book for seals from various temples and shrines. It was August and so goddamn hot. I was technically praying, but I spent way more time eating shaved ice and looking around little shops than I ever did praying. Just to get out of the sun. And it has a genuine effect. You feel that your life is improving as you visit each shrine because it genuinely is. You see new things, you meet new people, experience good things that usually you couldn't. There was no conflict between Saikaku writing about homosexuality, or indeed heterosexuality, as a monk. There was a short period of Buddhist condemnation of monastic homosexuality in the 10th century, but by the 17th century these criticisms were mostly gone, replaced by other understandings. There's a long history of stories written about the affairs of monks. Often in these stories, the object of affection turns out to be a bodhisattva, usually Kannon, otherwise known as Avalokiteshvara or Guanyin, whose goal was to push the monk to excel in the monastic world. This can be seen as a kind of skillful means, or upaya, a term that we use to talk about the way Buddhist teachings are adapted to be most effective for the listener. So a woman telling a man, "Oh, I couldn't possibly marry a man who hasn't even memorized the Lotus Sutra," is using that man's weakness to improve him. It's a common enough trope. You get to write the longing, the spicy content, all of those things, and it's okay, because in the end, it's educational. But the history of these kinds of documents made it very easy for Saikaku to write, even as a monk. And he played on that vibe all the time. In The Great Mirror, he uses Chinese precedent, referencing gay people who were well known in Japan because China has, historically, had the reputation as the big brother country, the place where legitimacy comes from. So if important people from China were gay, then gayness itself must be legitimate. At the same time, there's a sort of mocking tone when he uses legends to legitimize homosexuality. Not aimed at homosexuality, but at the absurdity of legends. Why should heterosexuality be understood as mandatory, just because there were two gods who needed to breed? Well, two can play at that game. And he was a shipper. He takes the homoerotic vibes of classical literature and uses it to invent long-running sexual relationships between characters that already existed. For example, we have Ariwara no Narihira, the hero of the Tale of Ise, and Daimon no Chujo, who Saikaku believes did and should have fucked. Now, personally, I think that he had a much more intimate relationship with his father-in-law, Kino Aritsune, but that's a topic for another show. He also assumes a long affair in the life of a historical figure who wrote the classic known as Essays in Idleness. That's not the only historical RPF he writes, though. He wrote whole short stories about news from the time. One story, The Sickbed No Medicine Could Cure, is believed to be based on a real happening in 1640, in which a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old both committed seppuku, due to the 16-year-old having had no choice but to kill a samurai who planned to murder him for rejecting him. The two young lovers died together in public and were written about in multiple publications before and after the publication of The Great Mirror of Male Love. And another story, the Onagata's Tosa Diary, is also about a real person, a kabuki actor and sex worker named Matsushima Hanya, who was such a skilled and desired sex worker and actor that a man in this story died from his heartbreak on having to part with him, and that convinced the actor to stop taking clients, to go through with the coming-of-age ceremony where he ritually came of age while he was still beautiful. The fact that in this story it's mentioned that people mourned that he ritually came of age while still beautiful is really interesting because it indicates how fluid the ideas of age and role were. You were a boy for as long as you kept a boy's hairstyle and a boy's hat. These are steps that signify the stage of life that a person was at, not unlike how you can put on a school uniform as an adult. Though, as with wearing a school uniform as an adult, society was still a little uncomfortable with that. So, in The Great Mirror of Male Love, there are around 4 stories that break the man-boy dynamic. 2 of them are pairs of children, and 2 are pairs of adults. In any case, there needed to be the age play. The fact that it wasn't real seems to have added an element of comedy to Saikaku's understanding of it. And it makes sense. He was writing about samurai and townsmen, but for an audience of townsmen who were reading for fun. Townsmen had much fewer hang-ups about age than samurai, though samurai did not necessarily require a large age gap either. When samurai lovers were close in age, the relationship was called kyodai keiyaku, or a brother relationship. But the top-bottom dynamics had to follow whatever age or rank difference there was. You cannot top your big brother. I couldn't possibly summarize all of the interesting stories in this episode, but I would like to quickly mention my favorite title in the book. Fireflies also work their asses at night. Damn, I bet they do. His work is a very fun read. Despite being largely tragedies, he is iconoclastic, even towards things that you think are his opinions. He will write a convincing moralist argument in one line, and then in the next mock it as smelling of Confucius. You can't nail him down on anything, which is part of what makes me comfortable talking about him in a neutral to positive way. So is he being ironic? Is he joking? Is he serious? I think it's genuinely impossible to tell. He doesn't seem to have a coherent message, except to tear down anything that's held in too high esteem. I mean, he had a moral code, we saw that earlier, even if the line might be hard to find today. But I can't find any evidence that he ever hurt anyone, other than his own children who he left with their family and abandoned. But men are like that sometimes. He mocks people who sacrifice the good things in their lives for their ambition, who lose it all to gambling or infatuation, and he points out the hypocrisy of priests who moralize about the evils of carnal lust while carving Buddha statues in the likenesses of their lovers. he reinforces the cultural importance of the sex worker by pointing out that fashions come from them more often than not, and treating their profession as highly skilled. It's a fascinating level of concern and sympathy to have, while brutally mocking people. Now, Saikaku died at the age of 51, having written 30 volumes of short stories on top of his poetry, and he was buried at Seigan Temple in Osaka. After he died, the world went on. Spoilers, I know, but the arts adapted to a changing economic context in the capital. One document, The Great Mirror of Male Actors, begins with the phrase, "In plays in former times, the theme of male love very often occurred. Principal actors playing young men often received larger salaries than those playing women. At that time, homosexual love was the rage for all the quarters of the town." And now that's fascinating. It implies a canon of lost gay kabuki plays. It also implies that the appeal of kabuki may not have been affected by the banning of women from the stage nearly as much as people think. Therefore, even though Saikaku is one of the early major sources of gay fiction from Japan that exists, he is just the most well-preserved example of a larger literary trend. A mere 100 years after Saikaku's death, the demand for gay sex work had declined by almost 90% in the cities. Scholars suggest that this was due to changing demographics in the economy. The heterosexual marriage rate skyrocketed among samurai as they settled into being bureaucrats rather than soldiers. And at the same time, job options for male minors had started to open up, and boys became able to leave their relatives with debt if they no longer wanted to work at the brothel after being sold to cover their family's debts. So for a while, queer writing seems to have been on the decline. There is a steady supply of gay erotic pictures throughout Japanese history, but the wealth of plays and novels and stories seem to be lost. This, unfortunately, and because every gay story intersects with at least 3 others apparently, allowed a terrifyingly gay man, best known under the pen name Mishima Yukio, to remark that his own novel, Confessions of a Mask, was the first important work to deal with homosexuality since Saikaku. To which I say, how dare he stand where Saikaku stood? Now, Saikaku would mock Mishima viciously. But that says a lot about how Saikaku was perceived. After Japan was opened back up to the world, his work was interpreted positively, both as a tradition to return to by traditionalists and as a model for literary reform by progressives. And now we have people referencing his fanfiction as an indispensable part of the gay literary tradition. It's really wild to me that it's possible that in the future historical records of real queer people might be destroyed, but we could know them in a way through our BL short stories. Remember, when you hear people say that gay and trans people are new or Western or unnatural or sinful, we've always been here. We are natural, normal, and numerous as dragonflies, flitting through history like an endless parade. I'm Alexandra Loop, and welcome to the Dragonfly Parade. Thank you for listening this far. I do have a Patreon, patreon.com/dragonflyparade, where I put out extra content. These are whole other episodes of this podcast covering things that I find fascinating and relevant to the study of queer history. I have deeper dives into the work of people I talk about in the main channel episodes, as well as talking about interesting tangents and dead ends I found, so you don't have to go down them too. If you like what I'm doing here and want to support me finding and bringing more resources on queer people to you, I would be grateful for your support. Resources on queer history don't tend to be accessible for free, so anything would help me get off the ground. The attached bonus episode for this podcast episode is a history of BL. I go a little bit more into the history of the Chigo Monogatari that I talked about a little bit further up. And I bring that all the way through to the modern history of the boys' love genre. You can also rate this podcast, like the video, or send me feedback, either on Patreon or on Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, at Dragonfly Parade, on all of those. Tell me what you thought. Any interesting info you want to add to the conversation? Any ideas for future episodes you want to hear about? I want to hear from you. It means the world to me that you listened this far. Thanks as always to Feifei for the wonderful cover art. And thank you to my first 2 supporters and dear friends, Lena and Cora. Thank you again. And come back next time to hear about the next person in the Dragonfly Parade.